Access to ultra-processed foods varies dramatically between urban and rural environments, and these differences have profound implications for consumption patterns, metabolic health, and chronic disease risk across the lifespan. Urban settings typically offer abundant exposure to fast food outlets, convenience stores, supermarkets stocked with packaged meals, and aggressive food marketing, creating a landscape where highly processed, calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods are not just accessible, they are ubiquitous. Rural environments, while sometimes less saturated with commercial outlets, face their own challenges, including limited availability of fresh produce, fewer grocery options, reliance on shelf-stable and packaged foods, and longer travel times to markets that carry whole foods. In both settings, these environmental pressures drive overconsumption of ultra-processed foods, but the mechanisms and consequences differ, shaping health outcomes from childhood through older adulthood. In urban areas, the constant availability of ultra-processed foods can overwhelm natural appetite regulation. Children and adolescents in cities are exposed to convenience foods not only at home but at school, in vending machines, and through media advertising, fostering early taste preferences for sugar, salt, and fat. Frequent exposure reinforces neural reward pathways that promote compulsive eating, while limited opportunities for outdoor activity and stress from school or social pressures amplify emotional eating tendencies. Longitudinal studies suggest that urban youth consuming high levels of processed snacks, sugary beverages, and fast food exhibit higher rates of obesity, insulin resistance, and early markers of metabolic syndrome compared to peers with less exposure. Adults living in cities face similar pressures. Demanding work schedules, ubiquitous food advertising, and 24/7 access to convenience meals encourage fast eating, portion distortion, and habitual overconsumption, which accelerates weight gain, cardiovascular risk, and chronic inflammation. For seniors, urban exposure to ultra-processed foods can compound age-related declines in metabolism and appetite regulation, increasing vulnerability to visceral fat accumulation, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cognitive decline. Rural populations experience a different, but equally insidious risk. Limited grocery options often make shelf-stable, packaged foods the default choice for daily meals, while fresh fruits, vegetables, and minimally processed proteins may be scarce or expensive. Food deserts, common in rural areas, force households to rely on ultra-processed items for their affordability, convenience, and long shelf life. Children in these environments develop similar patterns of early metabolic dysregulation, obesity risk, and addictive eating behaviors, even if overall caloric availability is lower than in urban settings. Adults may depend on processed foods due to limited transportation, long working hours, and economic constraints, increasing the prevalence of metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and chronic inflammation. Older adults in rural areas face compounded risk. Mobility limitations and chronic conditions often make cooking from scratch impractical, while dependence on packaged meals accelerates the decline of metabolic health, gut microbiome diversity, and cognitive resilience. Across both urban and rural environments, the food environment reinforces inequities and entrenches poor health outcomes. In cities, hyperaccessibility and aggressive marketing accelerate consumption patterns that favor ultra-processed foods. In rural areas, scarcity, high cost, and logistical barriers create structural dependence on these foods, limiting dietary choices and undermining metabolic and cognitive health. In both cases, children, adults, and seniors are exposed to sustained dietary patterns that promote obesity, insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, and chronic inflammation. Early exposure sets the stage for lifelong eating behaviors that are difficult to reverse, while decades of reliance on processed foods compound hormonal dysregulation, metabolic strain, and neurological vulnerability. The warning is stark. The environment, whether urban or rural, exerts a powerful influence on dietary habits and health outcomes, and both settings carry unique risks for overconsumption of ultra-processed foods. Urban exposure fosters excessive access, convenience-driven consumption, and heightened stress-linked eating, while rural exposure imposes structural constraints, limited food diversity, and reliance on shelf-stable processed items. Across all ages, these environmental pressures drive obesity, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive decline. Without targeted interventions to improve access to fresh, minimally processed foods, educate communities, and mitigate environmental drivers of overconsumption, both urban and rural populations are likely to experience escalating rates of chronic disease and reduced health span. The cumulative impact demonstrates that the food environment is not merely a backdrop, it is a determinant of lifelong health trajectories.